So good morning and welcome to all participants to the Bioenergy Europe and European Biochar Initiative joint event, Biomass-based Carbon Sinks, Carbon Neutrality 2050. My name is Julia Cancian and I'm the Policy Director of Bioenergy Europe, and I'll be your moderator for today. So with the climate neutrality goal for the EU being only 3 decades away, society and market operators need guidance to rethink and refocus the way they produce and consume. So all activities having an impact on the climate need to be scrutinized. And in this context, carbon sinks acquire an increased importance. And this is the reason why we want to focus on this issue today. So today we have with us 5 distinguished guests that will help us unpack the complex issues such as how to increase new carbon sinks, how to scale up negative emission technologies, how to improve the resilience of our forests, while keeping on providing renewable material and fuel to substitute fossil fuels, which we would like to remind are still really dominant today in energy generation and also material production. So one thing that we would like to underline is that there is no single solution to the climate crisis, and together we will explore today many different possible solutions, and we will focus on, in particular, on the ones that are biomass based, of course. So before we get to business, I would like to call your attention on a couple of housekeeping notes. We have received nearly 600 registrations today. I see that we have already 255 participants connected. So thank you very much for your interest. You can ask questions at any time during the event using the Q&A box that you will find on the bottom of the screen. And for comments or tech issues, please do write us in the chat. You can choose who to send a comment to. At the end of each presentation session, I will try and pick a couple of relevant questions from the chat box, and I will try my best to address them all. Should there be too many, speakers are also have the possibility to answer in written. So how the event will be structured today? You see the agenda on screen. During this webinar, you will hear 5 presentations. The first one will be on EU policy framework, and on the science, the second then on the science behind CO2 removal. We will speak about the role of forest in climate change mitigation, and about 2 tech-based solutions to achieve negative emissions. So on one side, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and on the other, biochar. So during the webinar, we have 5 speakers with us today. Dr. Simon Kay, Senior Expert of the European Commission Director General for Climate Action, Professor Jan Minks, Dr. Hans Vertrek from the European Forest Institute, and Dr. Kati Koponen from VTT, and finally Hans-Jörg Lerchenmüller, Chairman of the European Biochar Initiative that jointly organized this event with us. So to take the temperature of the room, I will propose a couple of polls along the event, and we will start with the first 2 questions before starting with the first presentation. I think that, yes, they are starting. So the first one is to get to know each other. What sector do you represent? You can choose one reply. Are you a biomass supplier or involved in forestry, a bioenergy producer, a technology provider involved with the R&D, or an EU or national public institution, or other? And the second question is to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, the EU should focus on, and you can choose among 3 replies. I will give you another 30 seconds to answer, maybe 40. And then we will sit together before we start with the first presentation. Okay, so we have with us today a nice mix of participants. around 15 representative of EU or national public institution. 21% of participants are coming from R&D, and the main group is qualified as other, but there are also a lot of biomass suppliers or representative of the forestry sector. On the second question, also we see very balanced answer. So to achieve climate neutrality, most of the participants think that we need to focus on energy efficiency and renewable energy generation, but also on the creation of market for climate-friendly products and services to timely scale up negative emission technologies, on focusing on nature-based solution and increase forest carbon sinks, raise awareness to influence consumer behavior, and very, very dominant question is also to create market rules with high carbon price and carbon removal certificates. So without further ado, we can start our event today, and we will start with the first presentation with Dr. Simon Kay. Dr. Kay will tell us about the role of EU policy on supporting negative emissions. Dr. Kay is a senior expert at the European Commission Directorate General for Climate Action, and he's covering the land sector and agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions and removal. After obtaining his doctorate at the University College London, he worked for nearly 2 decades in applied research linked to common agricultural policy implementation. And since 2013, he has been deeply involved in the formulation of the third pillar of the EU 2030 climate policy framework concerning land use and focusing on agriculture and forestry. Welcome, Dr. Kay, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Julia, and thank you very much also to the organizers for allowing me to kick off this. I think it's going to be a very, very interesting morning. I'm very aware that the 4 speakers who are coming a little bit later are going to go into quite a number of the topics that I will touch upon superficially. So that's really good because it helps us, let's say, pull these things together in a manner that I think is very, very pertinent, very timely. What I'm going to talk about is really what is going on at the moment with the European policy review and reform, in particular for stepping up climate action for the more ambitious 2030 target that our President von der Leyen has talked about under the Green Deal. That was a very interesting poll just to kick things off a little bit. And I see that there's an interesting spread of ideas. I'm not going to talk too much about energy efficiency and energy in particular. I'm going to talk more about what we can do with the current technologies, if you like, the nature-based technologies that we have available to us under the infamous LULUCF. I'm not going to talk about LULUCF very much, but I'm going to start. Next slide, please. I'll start with really, I think, where all this discussion about negative emissions comes from. You can go to the next slide. Perfect. Which is the Paris Agreement article. That fits nicely because I see that the next speaker will go into this in much more detail. But there's this important phrasing in the middle of paragraph 1 of Article 4, that there is an ambition to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks. And okay, here it talks about the second half of the century. This shows that the way forward is to get a balance of these anthropogenic emissions with, presumably, the way that census is structured, anthropogenic removals by sinks, and maybe even get into a situation where we have negative emissions beyond 2050. But to get that balance already by 2050, we need negative emissions. So next slide, please. So to reflect that, already a year ago, as part of the Green Deal, the Commission came forward with a proposal, which is still being discussed in Parliament and the Council, to put a legally binding target for climate neutrality by 2050 in place. So that proposal is, as I said, even a slightly more than a year old. It's been slightly modulated, if you like, by a proposal in September of last year, where the current target of emission reductions of -40%, at least -40% by 2030, has been proposed to be ramped up to at least 55% reductions by 2030. And this amends the Commission's proposal already from March last year. But to try to keep it simple, this sort of starts to put down the trajectory, the pathway of how to get to this balance by 2050. Very important part of the proposal in September is that in order to match this neutrality by 2050, we start to use a metric to describe the progress along that pathway that basically includes emissions and removals of greenhouse gases on land, or indeed technical nets, negative emission technologies. So the way that this target is framed is a little bit different from the way that it was framed in the current legislation for 2030. But nevertheless, what it means is that we start to place the focus on what happens with the whole of that balance between emissions and removals. I'm sure you're going to get the presentation later, and there's a link there on the bottom which gives a fact sheet and a bit more information on that vision at the bottom there. Next slide, please. So to try to put it into a bit more of a schematic, we have as our reference point, our starting point 1990. This is the so-called 100%, if you like. The way that we have the pathway defined now is the red line that wobbles from 1990 through to 2050. The part up to 2005 is taken from an inventory for this schematic showing what happened to emissions and removals, so the absorption of CO2 by, in this particular case, it's by land in the EU. And we have a reduction objective to get to 2030 by, of -55% compared to 1990 by 2030. Now that moves us on the way to 2050, and you can see that by 2050, where we have the green arrow on the right-hand side, there are still some emissions. And these emissions are, to give an approximate idea, around 10% of the emissions that were present in 1990. They tend to be ones that are linked to, let's say, activities that we find very difficult today to imagine will have a technology to eliminate those emissions. So one very clear example is agriculture, particularly livestock management. And this makes up, in fact, probably 50–60% of the emissions in the period around 2050. There are also some industrial emissions. There are also some small remaining emissions left with very specific technical issues. As you can see, the energy emissions, basically the power emissions disappeared. The industry emissions have reduced substantially. And we have to balance these with some kind of removals. What we foresee is that this will be made up of essentially removals from land, so-called nature-based solutions, or there will be carbon removal technologies or technical solutions like direct air capture, CCS, would still have to emerge, and that we think that these will be come under strong development in the next decade and really start to emerge as more mature technologies sometime in the middle of the next decade. So I think the 30-year perspective is very important, because the nature-based solutions are not something that happen overnight, and the carbon removal technologies also don't happen overnight. So this is, if you like, a schematic view of the vision of where we think we have to go. And so the next thing is, how do we define some policy framework to take us in that direction? Next slide, please. Now, to focus a bit on the land side of things, because those are the ones we have to deal with in the framework up to 2030, we really want to know what would be the ambitious and credible targets for land use change in forestry and agriculture. As I mentioned, agriculture is going to be an emitter in 2050, or that's what we project. But nevertheless, we need to reduce emissions in that sector, and therefore, what are credible targets that can be done without damaging, for example, our food production system, ensuring that we have nevertheless good environmental conditions associated with agricultural production and forestry. There are a lot of complex questions around how to set credible targets for that sector. But we also see that this setting targets is one thing, but we have to have incentives for action. So do we just rely on the incentives in policy frameworks like the Common Agricultural Policy, or do we move towards creating a better activity business model for those actors, and for them to be able to respond to, for example, demands for materials that go into the industry sector, so the bioeconomy, or to maybe produce biochar? Is that going to be a business model that can be followed up by farmers? Which way do we have to kind of look? Next slide, please. So to try to put some framing of the numbers, particularly by 2030, because that's what we're thinking very hard about at the moment. So we want to see what we can do in this intermediate time frame. Can we, for example, increase the negative emissions or the removals, as we prefer to call them under LULUCF, to around 300 million tons CO2 equivalent by 2030. Today, the legislation would require member states to arrive at about 225 million tons. So that would be an ambition increase. But what short-term action can we do? Because particularly, for example, in forestry, we need maybe decades to get to some good results. Then, as I mentioned, on the agriculture side, so the non-CO2 emissions, this is basically methane and nitrous oxide. How can we get to a reduction by 2030 where we are able to have nevertheless a functioning farming sector that produces biomass also for different aspects of the economy? And how can we get farmers and land managers involved in the aspect of promoting and enhancing negative emissions? And then what about a vision for something a little bit more broad, if you like, climate neutral land bioeconomy by 2035? Well, we have in our framework for the impact assessment work we're doing, we want to look at how the circular economy, carbon removals, can we develop markets for farmers and foresters, and can we actually get a ball rolling, if you like, on the climate neutral bioeconomy, so that we can increase those carbon removals to something towards 500 million tons. Remember, I mentioned that some will be delivered by technical nets, so not all of them from land, but to get to around this 500 million tons in 2050. So that was the number that we figured was ballpark for the balancing. Maybe in the next presentation, we'll even see a better number. Next slide, please. So we've got a number of overarching policy frameworks, almost too many, I think, but we've tried to here structure them a little bit on production-oriented, demand-oriented, and if you like, some technical standardization in between to help bridge between them. So on the left-hand side, production-oriented strategies, we've got farm to fork, which is all about how our food systems work together. We've got the biodiversity strategy, which means that we have to ensure that we don't destroy our environment at the same time. We don't get rid of all our forests, for example. We also have the forest strategy, which is should be bringing together a more harmonized European way of the way we look at forests. And the LULUCF regulation itself is one of the elements being reviewed right now, along with the emission trading system and the effort sharing regulation, which has the targets for each member state. So on the right-hand side, we've got things that are going to start creating demand, if you like, for basically carbon that could help us deliver negative emissions. So the renovation wave could help us put better building materials into storage, carbon-based building materials, so like wood. But we have to have the right regulations for them. So construction products regulations. The Circular Economy Action Plan is supposed to help deliver as well on things like carbon farming. That's a point in the middle. Bioeconomy strategy as well. Can we actually move away from using fossil feedstocks and using instead sustainable biofeedstocks? And of course, energy efficiency is an underpinning element of that, to try to make more biomass available for other things that are related to, basically carbon sinks at the end of the day. So in the middle, we have this kind of element where we think we need to facilitate together this through carbon farming, wood construction material. We need to try to work out how that can be, how can a product made in one member state be used in a second member state and still count towards the reduction targets? Do we have standards for carbon removals? Is a removal in a soil as good as a building material, or a similar emission reduction? And there's the question of the voluntary and regulatory carbon markets that we think we need to leverage, because there's a lot of money starting to go into the voluntary markets, and that could certainly be very useful. There's an ambition to use, look at what Microsoft is doing with buying removals certificates at the moment already, and has a plan for 2030. Next slide, please. Oh, there's a little pop-up coming if you press, So we're focusing at the moment on showcasing initiatives and blueprints. We're also focusing on re-wetting and draining of peatlands, not so relevant perhaps to this discussion. Agroforestry and afforestation we see as relatively short-term wins, and woody construction material is one of the ones where we're quite keen to be working on to find examples of technical frameworks. Next slide, please. Another important, very important factor, and I think also given the technologies that are linked a bit below, is the Innovation Fund. It's not my specialization and I don't have much time left, but there is a link there below to give you more information if you're not aware of it already. It's a 10 billion fund, 10 billion euro fund set up over the next decade. We've already had one call with €1 billion to be assigned to various sized projects, where the focus is really on things ranging from carbon capture and storage through to how to reduce emissions in energy intensive industries, renewables, etc. So I am pretty sure that there will be plenty of people on the nearly 300 participants today who could be interested in. Please follow that up. There are small projects which are up to €7.5 million worth of funding, and then there are bigger ones which are quite a lot larger in terms of the funding potentials. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, where are we and what's coming at the moment? So the climate policy proposals, as I mentioned, related to the emission trading system, ESR and LULUCF will come up forward in the middle of 21. So end of June is the planned date. And then a little bit later, or the red review probably will come up. So Renewable Energy Directive is also being looked at. Forest strategy should come out fairly soon afterwards as well. By the end of the year, probably biodiversity restoration proposals in terms of how to ensure that the biodiversity elements are being safeguarded correctly. Innovation Fund calls, as I mentioned, will be taking place this year. One call large, one call small, so keep an eye out on that. Forward thinking for the next couple of years, we need to evolve on carbon farming. So how do we leverage action in addition to what is requested in the Common Agriculture Policy, for example, and provide removals or biomass? And we're running a number of studies related to improved monitoring, the impacts of biogenic product substitution, for example. And we should come forward in 23 with some proposals for carbon removal certification. And my last slide is the next slide with some links. I hope to, so you can go to the next slide. I don't see it yet, right? Yes, there it is. Okay, with some links to some material with explaining the climate target plan proposal from September and the impact assessment and annexes on that. And in 3 months, we'll have the other proposals available. Thank you very much. And if there's time for any questions, I'm certainly happy to handle a couple.
Thank you, that's okay. Indeed, there are many questions from the attendance. It was a rather engaging presentation. Main takeaway is that I see that the Commission is planning a very complex response to a complex problem. And from myself, one question that I would like to ask you regards the dimension of time. So when speaking about carbon removal, time has a very important role. And my question is how the Commission is going to deal with this. No? So you mentioned different possibilities. You mentioned storing carbon, for example, in buildings, and you mentioned the element of fossil fuel substitution, the materials, the bioeconomy. But also possible technologies or nature-based solution. So how will the Commission look at the element of on time in characterizing all these possible solutions?
Well, so in terms of time, let's say the first most, it's a little bit of an abstract one, is the issue of permanence. I suppose is whether it reverses. And I think particularly with the nature-based solutions, the ones linked to having biogenic carbon stores above ground, for example, in forests, the difficulty is what happens if we invest in developing the carbon stock in a forest, but then to find that it's damaged by bark beetle, for example. And so there is a time element that we need to look at how to take into account in the carbon removal certification and a trading system, for example. That's very, very important. I think with respect to, so that's one, if you want to make something saleable, then if I, as a consumer of a carbon sink, for whatever reason, it might be an industry that needs it or something to offset an emission in a balanced system, then I need to know that that sink is not going to disappear and maybe literally go up in flames. And there are a number of approaches to do that, buffering and insurance and discounting. Those we'll look at under the removal certification issue. I think with respect though to the target setting, we're moving from a phase where we tended to look at a relative system in the past, a Kyoto style system, into one where we look at the reported figures in a particular year. And there is a risk, but the risk is less when it's, if you like, it's collectively looked at across the EU. There is less, a fire in a Mediterranean forest doesn't have an impact at an EU level, but it might have an impact at the regional level. So we have to look at the way to frame those risks to ensure that they are captured in the system. But I don't think we're going to use time. And the fact that we report the information each year in terms of basically the stock of carbon that is being changed from year to year means that we don't have the issue of thinking we've cut a tree down and it takes 100 years to grow back again, because we know that it's been cut down and it's recorded as being cut down in the system. At least that's the theory. We need to make sure we have that recording done very precisely. I've answered it very quickly, but maybe we want to get another question in before we stop. I can't hear you, Julia.
I will pick under 2 or 3 questions, and some very technical ones. The first one will be from Jean-Marc Jossap. He asks, can you confirm that the number related to forest sink, 300 million tons, and carbon reduction, 500 million tons, are all per year? So we should read 300 million tons a year, etc.
Yeah, in fact, it's even more precise. Those would be at the date of 2030 or at the date of 2050. How you calculate at 2030, 2050 is still, I think, up for discussion. Should it be an average over a period plus or minus 2-3 years around 2030? But indeed, it's in the year. But it's not only forest sink. That's very important. And the 300 million tons is an aggregate of what we understand to be the scope of LULUCF today. So this is the forest sink at the moment is something around 400 million tons. But we have emissions in the LULUCF sector that are of 135 million tons or so. So in total, we have about 260 million tons of sink. So that's what's reported today. So yes, it is the year, but it's not only forest. Please, let's not consider that removals is an aggregate of the scope of the sector.
Very well. I will pick another question from Hannes Tuanihiti. Does the Commission plan to regulate the voluntary compensation market somehow? You did mention some voluntary initiatives that are starting up and that are growing a lot in the market. So what will be the relation between the regulators and these initiatives that are basically naturally coming up in the market?
I wouldn't say that we're trying to regulate the voluntary market. The voluntary market would probably always remain a voluntary market that can be established whoever and whenever. The difficulty at the moment is that an investor in the voluntary market is effectively placing a bilateral contract with someone who produces an action. I'm not even saying it produces sink, but it produces action. And it is then not possible for us at the moment to use that action in a member state's account and a member state's target. And what we would like to see is whether we can actually regulate a non-voluntary market that is able to be fitting into this into the framework where we can report to UNFCCC, formally knowing that there's been a financing of a certain piece of action done between maybe 2 actors in society, but that can come into play in the actual accounts of a member state directly, and that therefore we can leverage the interests of companies and societies to invest. So again, I take the example of biochar. At the moment there could be very easily a voluntary market set up around biochar, but where would be the benefit that would trickle down to a member state in terms of reporting to UNFCCC on meeting the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement? So there's no connection there. And also biochar done in Germany, does that mean that it's equivalent to something that would be understood as being a sink in Spain? And we need to make sure that those things connect together. So no, we're not trying to regulate the voluntary market. It would be more like ensuring we can leverage the voluntary market to work in a more formal framework.
Okay, thank you for your replies. At the moment, we have around 20 questions in the chat. I will not be able to take them all, but that's okay. You're free to answer in written if you'd like. And thank you very much for your presentation, and stay with us. So we will have some questions at the end of the event. We can now pass to the second presentation of the day. We're speaking now about the role of CO2 removal in meeting the Paris Agreement with Professor Jan Links. Professor Jan Links is a professor of climate change and public policy at the University of Leeds, but he's also the head of the Marketer Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change in Berlin. He works on a broad range of topics in climate and sustainability policies, such as pathways to climate neutrality, the role, potential, risk, and governance of carbon dioxide removal technologies. So thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my slides with you. Thanks again for the invitation. And what I would like to do within the next 15 minutes is to talk about the role of CO2 removal in meeting the Paris Agreement. And I will do this based on comprehensive systematic review work we have been doing over the years. Particularly one very comprehensive study in 3 parts that was, I believe, quite influential also in shaping some of the insights on carbon dioxide removal within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in the special report on the 1.5 degree target. If you're interested in those review pieces, also pop me an email. There are references at the bottom, but we have done more in that space. What I would like to do is to go through this issue of CO2 removal in 3 steps. One, just to quickly clarify the role of CO2 removal in climate change mitigation. Then secondly, I will give you an overview of what we can learn from an ensemble of several hundreds of scenarios that are on climate change mitigation scenarios that are typically considered by the IPCC and other climate change assessments, and what we can learn from that. And then I will go into more the kind of technology literature and what we can learn on the individual options that are available or people are working on. So what is the role of carbon dioxide removal in climate change mitigation? And I think this has already been highlighted in the talk before. It's a critical component, and we have only been realizing this for the last 5 to 10 years, slowly, I would say. So with the insight that keeping a certain temperature target implies a carbon budget that is absolutely limited also means that at some point we need to hit net zero emissions, so climate neutrality, CO2 neutrality. And from that entire or from this fact, we can see 2 particular roles of carbon dioxide removal in climate change mitigation. The first is related to what is called net negative emissions. So basically what we are seeing is that in many climate change mitigation scenarios, we see in the second half of the 21st century, we see net negative emissions. So CO2 is removed, there is a net removal of CO2 emissions at the global level. So we don't have only a balance between the sources and the sinks, but we even remove more than we are still emitting. And I think that is an important point. And why do we have this? Is because the transition to a pathway well below 2 degrees often takes longer. So we exhaust the carbon budget for a while. So we have a budget overshoot and then we pull it back. It's like a credit with a bank. The second issue is that was already highlighted is that there are also emissions that are very, very difficult to mitigate, to reduce. We often call them residual fossil fuel emissions, but also other non-CO2 emissions. And those also need to be compensated to even achieve a net zero. And so that is the second purpose. So the compensation of residual emissions is the second purpose. And overall, we see in those scenarios that even though a lot of focus in the discussion has been given to net negative, there is this a much larger component of gross negative emissions that often cumulates to several hundreds of a billion tons of CO2 that is removed globally. So let us now go to second step and look at those climate change mitigation scenarios. And here we focus particularly on the 1.5 degree mitigation scenarios. So scenarios with at least 50% probability to keep warming below 1.5 degree. These are the dark blue shades. And we have to acknowledge that the carbon budget for achieving 1.5 is really, really small. And so what we see in those models is that or in these scenarios, that it's a very consistent picture that the world is basically decarbonized by 2050 through, above all, sharp emission reductions. And then we have a sustained period of deep net negative emissions thereafter. So from 2050 onwards in those models, there is a net removal of carbon dioxide because the 1.5 budget is so small, so that we have to pay back our carbon debt in a sense. And if you look at this in numbers in certain years, then we see that up to 15 gigatons are already deployed by 2050. So that's a massive upscaling challenge. Of course, 15 is at the higher end, but even scaling up to 3 or 5 or 10 is already a massive undertaking. And of course, in that upscaling is consistently faster than in 2 degree scenarios. And what we also find consistently is that you don't find 1.5 scenarios that do not have substantive CO2 removals involved. And that's different for 2 degree scenarios. So the lighter blue bar you can see reaches down to 0 as well. So there are actually 2 degree scenarios that don't deploy larger amounts of CO2 removal technologies. Let us now look at scenarios that keep warming below 2 degrees. And here, the point I want to make is that this nicely shows that there is a big variation of things we can do and a big variation in the role of CDR can play. So this is where this is already obvious when you look at the net emission pathways of different sets of 2 degree scenarios. So you see this wide array of where they end up towards the end of the century, some very deep in the net negative and others remaining actually positive. And so what we actually see is that most immediate action scenarios that deploy a full technology portfolios actually usually have a lot of carbon dioxide removal involved. Here you see that the cumulative carbon dioxide removal across the 21st century is more than 500 gigatons for most of the scenarios, like closer to actually 700. So that's actually massive. And we also see that even in 2 degree scenarios, we have already more than 5 gigatons of removal in 2050. But, and this is really important, those scenarios do experiments where they actually say, okay, now we don't have certain options. And if you limit bioenergy use or you disable bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, we actually see in those scenarios that there is that is also still possible to reach 2 degrees with actually no larger involvement of carbon dioxide removal. One important point is also lower energy demand pathways also have lower CDR requirements and provide therefore additional flexibility for CDR deployment. I think that is a very, very important point. We need flexibility, and what we don't know, because there is some uncertainty in what we can do over the long term in terms of scale with CDR. It's really, really important that we have flexibility, and energy demand, low energy demand pathways are actually low risk pathways. That's pretty clear in the literature, and they provide more flexibility. One last point here is that a delay in climate action, so meaning if we continue along an emission pathway that we have seen globally over the last 2 decades or so, until 2030, and even like in some of the the current level of the NDCs, still brings us in terms of 2-degree scenarios into a world that looks like 1.5 degree scenarios today, where we fundamentally depend on the availability of carbon dioxide removal. This is taken from the IPCC 1.5 report, just to make this point again. So we can have really, really different CDR pathways, but they have very different implications. So if we want to, if we do not want to bet on carbon dioxide removal, we need to actually remove emissions much more rapidly, and also actually reduce residual emissions much more, while of course, if you have like huge amounts of removal, there is more flexibility in that sense, but it's a risky bet, because at this moment in time, we don't know how much carbon dioxide removal we will actually be able to do. Now comes the last part of my talk, where I want to highlight some of the options. We have already heard there are a range of what people often call natural carbon dioxide removal options, like afforestation, reforestation, biochar, soil carbon sequestrations, other land use, and wetland. There are combined natural and technological solutions, I would say, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And there are other solutions like accelerated weathering, where actually minerals are crushed in order to bind the CO2, direct air capture, where the CO2 is removed from the ambient air, ocean alkalinity enhancements, again, where alkaline materials are crushed and added to the oceans, but also actually there's a whole a range of options in terms of storing CO2 in durable products. And even though the discussion on carbon dioxide removal is rather new, we all know you know, some of these options. We have been dealing with them for a long time, like previously pointed out in the context of LULUCF, etc. What we then did when we did those reviews of carbon dioxide removal, of the carbon dioxide removal literature in scientific journals, is that we really systematically identified the literature through transparent search queries. Then we scoped, we basically sorted through all those 6,500 documents to actually identify a core set of 2,000 documents, and then we identified those that actually had information on cost, potential side effects, more than 900 documents, and we looked at the entire sample again in order to see where we are in terms of innovation and upscaling. And that basically we published quite prominently in a 3-part review that you can also get. It's an open access journal, Environmental Research Letters. And I only want to summarize the main outcome of these of this review. So basically, we looked at all those different things, and this is summarized here. In the middle, you see the panel, the central panel, which basically shows an expert judgment based on a collection of available estimates in the literature, how much carbon we can remove on the x-axis and what it costs on the y-axis. And the main outcome, I don't want to actually talk here about individual options, is that we have relevant potentials for all CDR options except for ocean fertilization, where the literature is a bit divided. All options also share that they are constrained by some biophysical or economic limits. So land-based solutions often have sustainability constraints in terms of the land use. Direct air capture is constrained by higher costs right now, etc. And this is really crucial to point out. And those potentials are actually therefore also not additive, because there are, for example, different land based options competing. And therefore, there is no silver bullet. No, there is not a single bullet. There is not a single option that can provide us with all the carbon dioxide removal that we need. So we actually need to think about portfolios of multiple CDR options, each deployed at modest scales, so that we can hedge their deployment risks. This to us seemed more realistic as a key outcome of that quite comprehensive review effort. It's also important to point out that the different options are differently differ in terms of their how advanced they are in terms of their deployment. So afforestation, reforestation, soil carbon sequestration, for example, they are ready to go basically, but then there are other options like bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, where we are still more in niche markets, in niche market deployments, or full-scale demonstration projects. So we actually, if you think of innovation not only as classical R&D, but as something that also involves diffusions and upscaling, then there's really still quite a way to go. And those options also, and this was also highlighted before, basically differ in terms of their level of or how reversible they might be. So land-based or nature-based solution often being more fragile, and those technological solutions having better properties for permanent storage. It's also something that we need to consider. And so one of the big questions or one of the suggestions we were taking from this whole review is that there might be actually natural order, given that we, in terms of CDR, scaling up CDR option, given that we have to start now, as you've seen this in some of the early slides, the only thing we can actually really scale at the moment are those nature-based solutions, but we need to continue developing the other ones to phase them in later. And just to make this point that we cannot underestimate this innovation, this long way innovation goes, or the long time innovation processes take. Take the example of solar PV, which was first commercially deployed in 1957. And we reached low cost PV around 2015, 2010, 2017. Choose a number. It's not so important, but roughly 70 years later, if we basically, or 60 years later, if we would deploy the same logic now and apply that to direct air capture, where we had the first commercial deployment in 2017, that would bring us to 2077 in kind of low cost direct air capture, but this would still not mean that it's widely adopted, and that would take additional time. So one thing we really believe is that with the technological options, we really have an innovation gap, and we need to seriously think how we can accelerate development and how we can design policies to accelerate their development. So let me summarize. CDR has arrived in policy, growing understanding that CDR is essential for meeting the climate goals. Many climate change mitigation scenarios scale up CDR rapidly to meet the Paris climate goals, but there is a need to limit our dependence from them. Why? Because we don't know how fast we will actually be to scale. So it's not an emission reductions versus carbon dioxide removal is rapid emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal. I think right now there's a bias in the scenario literature towards specs, something that I haven't emphasized too much, but it is, and there are more technologies available with relevant potentials. As I highlighted, all of these technologies are constrained by some biophysical or economic limits. There is no silver bullets. Any single option is unlikely to provide the potentials observed in many scenarios, and CDR portfolios of multiple options are therefore the way to go, in our view, with nature-based solutions maybe kicking off or making the start. Again, there's a large gap between CDR upscaling in scenarios and reality. We need to accelerate innovation and diffusion. It's not an either or. We need rapid emission reductions and concerted efforts to scale up CO2 removal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Minks, for this presentation. Two takeaways that I would like to underline is that there is no silver bullet. All options have a certain amount of constraints, and in order to mitigate the risk, we will have to invest in a portfolio of different solutions at modest scale. You also underline the importance of energy efficiency when talking about the 2-degree scenario. Let me ask you just a clarification. You underlined the energy savings potential in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction, but do you still think that for the achievement of the 2 degrees Celsius objective, for example, in general, the Paris Agreement, we will need to implement at scale and timely all the solutions, so removals as well as energy efficiency?
Yes, for sure. I mean, the carbon budgets are so limited that we see that that models, if you even, and it's important to say this is an ensemble analysis. So we are not looking at one model. We are looking at different models that are calibrated in different ways, etc. And those models actually all show that they need flexibility because the budget is so tight. And therefore, they are always using all the options. And they are not selecting very much. But with energy efficiency, there is a different point that is really important. Energy efficient scenarios are different from others because they are much less reliant on supply technologies. And what we see in the real world, but also in the academic discussion, a lot of discussions about risks, and those low energy demand pathways are low risk pathways because energy demand savings are just much less risky. So there have been then adding power plants of whatever type, like be it renewable energies or of different kinds, so that even though they are low or no or negative emission technologies, their risks are usually larger than the risks associated with saving that unit of energy. And therefore, this is a quite consistent finding that we can see in the literature.
Thank you. So consistently with the slide where you showed the time frame that it takes for a certain technology to become commercial or sustainable price-wise, I would just read out a couple of comments that are coming up in the question and answer box at the moment, because I think are consistent with this observation. The first one will be from Sorav Kalita. And it says, the main problem that I see is that while climate change is accelerated at an exponential rate, policy response is relatively slow and implementation even slower. At this rate, policy will never catch up to achieve the goals that are being set. And another comment again on afforestation. Afforestation ready to go. Where? And again, underlining the constraints on poor people's lands overseas, What about fires and disease, lack of water, tree species, etc.? So a lot of considerations are being made. A question that I saw popping up in the Q&A box before was also from Luc Peltmans, and was asking a bit about carbon capture and storage for fossil application. As you mentioned, there are certain sectors that are really, really difficult to abate. So what about also this kind of solutions?
Let me try and answer quickly. The first one is, of course, a question that is often coming up. Policy is slow. I would go back to the example of PV. We didn't have we had several small policy actions starting already in the 70s on PV in the oil crisis, and then ending say with the German feed-in tariffs and other feed-in tariffs. And that kicked off actually a technology revolution that has been consistently underestimated by models. So the technological progress is actually much faster than anticipated by models, and I think that's a really good news. So what I'm taking away, at least if we have certain types of innovations, particularly those that are more granular and more suitable for mass productions, there are huge economies of scale that can be reaped and that are commonly underestimated. We have just written a paper on this because models are so bad in actually reproducing like a PV pathway. That is really stunning. And even expert judgments, 10 years ago, nobody would have predicted that PV is where it is today. So I think there's at least a glimmer of hope when certain options are scaling. On CCS, on fossil CCS, this is of course also in all these models, it's in there. And some fossil CCS is necessary, and models use fossil CCS differently. There are still models using coal CCS. For me, that's given where we are, that's a bit surprising, but it's there, right? So, and it's obviously an option, and some countries may decide to do that. But where it's quite common is in certain industrial applications like cement production, where it's and that's also in there. So we are, and that is also one of the competitions that is going on for also CCS storage. So we need to be CCS is slow to scale because it's a huge technology, lots of regulation with those projects. We need to carefully think about what we use fossil CCS for, and if we want to use it, or whether or not we use it to generate negative emissions via BECCS. Afforestation, I mean, I agree. It's a challenge. But I think what I wanted to say is that with those kind of practices, we have experience and we know how to do it, and we could start scaling. But of course, it's not the most land efficient way of removing carbon. So, but I think there's also a place for afforestation. I think it's probably not necessarily the largest, but that's important. And of course, above all, we also need to protect the existing forests. I mean, that is nothing about negative emissions, but just making sure that we also that we protect remaining ecosystems and also carbon sinks.
So thank you, Professor Minks, and thank you also for this glimpse of positivism or optimism technologically wise. And stay with us. We will have still a couple of questions at the end of the event. We can pass now to the third session. We have already mentioned a little bit the role of forest in this, both in the first and in the second presentation, but with Dr. Hans Verkerk, we will explore a bit more the potential and challenges for European foresting climate change mitigation. Dr. Hans Verkerk is a principal scientist in the bioeconomy program of the European Biochar Institute and leads a team on climate smart forestry. He holds a Master of Science in Forest and Nature Management from Wageningen University and obtained his PhD from the University of Eastern Finland. Welcome, Dr. Verkerk, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for this introduction, and also thank you, Bioenergy Europe and the European Biochar Industry for organizing this interesting event and for inviting me to talk on the potential and challenge of for European forest and climate change mitigation. So I will pick up that topic in this talk, and I will also bring forward the concept of climate smart forestry, which combines climate change mitigation also with the need for adaptation to climate change. In 2015, 195 countries in the world agreed on the Paris Agreement, in which they agreed to reduce the increase of global average temperature to 2 degrees, or preferably even to 1.5 degrees. So huge changes are needed to achieve those targets. I think it was also quite nicely outlined by Jan Minks in the previous presentation. But when you look at the policies and efforts or intentions that are currently in place, it will not be possible to keep the 1.5 degree target, and it will be extremely unlikely we will even keep the 2 degree target. So some serious challenges are ahead. But even if we would keep these targets, we will still have a temperature increase. So there will still be impacts on society, on ecosystems, and on forests. Natural climate solutions have been suggested to play a key role in climate change mitigation. So you can reduce emissions from energy production, industrial activities, or halt in deforestation. But natural climate solutions are improved land management practices, and they also can contribute to climate change mitigation. So it has been estimated that the natural climate solutions can reduce or can represent 37% of the required emission reductions that are needed by 2030 to keep the increase below 2 degrees. So if you look at the potentials that have been estimated, the forest part are dominating. So they are representing 2/3 of the potential of natural climate solutions. And in addition to that, storing carbon in forest biomass, soils, and wood products is the only proven method to remove CO2 from the atmosphere still, so far, at least on a large scale. But there's also some challenges ahead. Forests are natural systems, and storing carbon in forests is therefore also not necessarily free of risks. So large disturbances are not occurring very frequent, but they can result in a lot of economic damage and loss of lives. There have been also some very clear examples of big disturbances taking place in Europe. The Gudrun hurricane in Sweden in 2005 caused huge damage. The Vaia storm in 2018 in North Italy resulted in 8 million cubic meters of damage, which is equal to the country's annual roundwood production. And more recently, also we see very big disturbances taking place in Central Europe as a result of drought followed by bark beetle outbreaks. They have also led to very large damages to forests. So as an example, the JRC recently produced a report, and they collected, in which they presented statistics on salvage wood, so wood what is collected from the forest after a disturbance has been taking place. And they find that some 11 to 20% of the wood comes from disturbances. This is not equally distributed over countries. So in countries like Sweden, some 3% of all the wood that is harvested comes from salvage, or so after disturbances. But in other countries like Czech, the numbers can be up to 90%. So it can, in some countries, be really significant volumes. When we look at the literature, we also see that there's an increasing risk for disturbances expected in studies for the future. So you see here the results of a review that has been conducted and published on the responses that studies find on the increases of particular disturbance risk. So all of these studies indicate, or many of these studies indicate, an increased risk for forest disturbances taking place into the future. And this makes strategies that focus on carbon storage in the forest perhaps less successful than anticipated. At the same time, we also have a growing population, and people get increasingly rich. And it is also expected that the demand for materials will increase very strongly if we don't change our behavior. So until 2050, the expected demand for raw materials is expected to increase significantly, and this may be associated even with more than 40% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So this is obviously not the direction where we should be going. Forests can provide a raw material that can act as an alternative for some of these materials. But forests are not only providing raw materials, they are such as wood, but they also provide non-wood forest products, but they're also very important for providing recreation opportunities to people. They provide opportunities for spirituality. They have protective functions that contribute to water quality and water availability. So forests provide many functions and benefits to society, and these all need to be taken into account. So to take all these requirements towards forest into account, we have been trying to develop the climate smart forestry concept. Climate smart forestry aims to connect mitigation and adaptation together to improve the resilience of forests and meet the needs of a growing population in the world. So it builds on sustainable forest management, but we try to focus, have a clear element more on climate. So the key messages, the key issues that we think that should be pursued under climate smart forestry is enhance carbon storage in forest ecosystems. But focus on carbon storage not be separate from adaptation. So combine mitigation and adaptation measures together in the management of forests. And thirdly, wood can be used, but it should be done sustainably, and it can be used to substitute non-renewable carbon-intensive materials. Forests in Europe, they cover some 160 million hectares approximately, and thereby cover 40% of the EU territory. Currently, forests remove some 350 million tons of CO2 annually, and they also store some additional more than 40 million tons of carbon or CO2 is also stored in products annually. So altogether, EU forests and products compensate for more than 10% of the total EU emissions. So this is what is currently happening. But of course, there's also possibilities to increase the role of forest in climate change mitigation. So there's a few global studies that have been conducted, and a nice review is presented by Stefan Rowe and colleagues. And you see some of the potentials that have been estimated at the global level listed below. So afforestation is by far considered the largest potential, provide the largest potential for a forest globally. Halting deforestation is another major measure, and forest management is also considered to provide a significant potential. This is a little bit blurring the picture, because even if you would do afforestation, forest management is also considered over there, because if you establish a forest, you still have to make choices about how you want to establish the forest and which species could be considered if you do an active afforestation effort. So the role of forest management, even in these, is all quite important. So then, if we would want to combine mitigation and adaptation together, well, one needs to combine mitigation and adaptation together. So how could one do this? So that really depends on the local or the regional conditions taking place, and also the structure and the importance of different aspects of the forest. So a strategy could focus on carbon storage, especially in old forests that are not at risk of disturbance, or focus on carbon storage and on places that have a protective function, so to prevent, for example, also erosion. So to try to combine options. But in other areas where there might be a high risk of disturbances, for example, in the Mediterranean with wildfires, it might be better to activate forest management. So one of the main reasons of forest fires is, of course, the human factor, but also because there's an accumulation of biomass, an uncontrolled accumulation of biomass taking place, and management can help to control that accumulation and thereby reduce the risk of wildfires breaking out and help to maintain the carbon stocks that are in the forests. So active forest management can also provide contributions. Silvicultural methods could be improved, so there's possibilities to improve tree breeding, consider planting, or how harvesting is currently being considered, and this could help also to improve the carbon storage within forests. Another important issue will also be to increase the share of different species to make forests more resilient to disturbances and also make them more attractive for all sorts of species, so to improve biodiversity. And then the third element of climate smart forest we want to stress is also the sustainable use of wood and substitution. So once a tree is cut, part of the wood is moved to products, and carbon is these products store carbon also for a certain period of time. But in addition to that, these wood products may be used to substitute or replace other non-renewable fossil intensive materials, and thereby they can also provide benefits for climate change through substitution. So we conducted a review of all published studies on substitution effects, and we generally find that substitution effects do provide benefits, at least at the product level. So when you replace a material such as steel or concrete by wood, you will have this could lead to less emissions occurring to the atmosphere. So substitution should also be part of a holistic approach to how forests can contribute to climate change mitigation. So it needs to include both the carbon storage in forests and ecosystems, forest ecosystems, so biomass and soil, wood products, and also through substitution effects. In the context of products, I would also like to highlight a few new products. So there's a need for new products to reduce emissions, but also to reduce pollution. So with many of the many products, there's also problems with pollution occurring. Also small uses of plastics or plastics that come in the environment, and new wood-based products could help to avoid these kind of problems. So in the following, I would provide some examples of some innovative wood-based products. One of the perhaps well-known emerging wood products is cross-laminated timber. It's different pieces of wood that are typically glued together, and it can substitute for concrete, masonry, or steel in buildings. There's a very strong advantage that it can be made prefab, and it's much lighter to transport and have still important structural capacities, and therefore it is an important material that could replace concrete or steel, and thereby provide reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Wood foam is another product that is coming. Here an example is shown for a packaging material. It's developed at the VTT, so also the next speaker will be talking, is representing this organization. So wood foam can be used to replace polystyrene or polyethylene, and as a packaging material, but it can also be used in construction. For example, it has good acoustic and thermal insulation properties, so it can be used also in walls, or it can be used as a middle layer in furniture and doors. So it's also made from wood fibers, and it doesn't involve the use of binders or resins, and therefore it doesn't include any toxics or other harmful substances. Bioplastics are another example where wood could have a good contribution. These products typically made from side streams coming from the forest industry, and it can also bioplastic can substitute for fossil-based polyethylene and polyurethane. And they can be made from side streams such as tall oil or lignin. Finally, an example that is also interesting is wood-based textiles. So there's a growing concern that related to the release of microplastics, and also with the environmental impacts of cotton production. And wood-based textiles might be providing a good alternative. So there's new technologies being developed that replace some of the older technologies, such as viscose. And in these new technologies, there would be no harmful chemicals be used anymore in the production. So it might be also an environmental benefit that could be provided through the use of wood-based textiles. So these were a few examples of products, and then I come to the end of my talk. So just to summarize a bit, for forest management, for forestry to contribute to climate change mitigation, it's important to consider both mitigation and adaptation together. If you don't look at adaptation, there's a risk that the mitigation potentials are not achieved. We should not look only at what happens within the forest, but we should look at the whole chain. So look at what happens in the forest, in biomass, in soil. We should look at what happens in the products, and we should be looking at potential substitution effects. We should also have a long-term perspective there, because some of the impacts will occur later in time. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for climate-smart forestry. So it really depends on the local conditions, the regional context. So there will be an improved understanding needed of how climate-smart forestry can be implemented in Europe or across other regions of the world. This was what I wanted to present. So thank you, and I give the floor back.
Thank you, Dr. Beckerek. That was a very interesting presentation, and we have quite some questions indeed in the chat coming from this. The first I will ask, so forests are really under the spotlight and at the center of political discussions at the moment in Europe and globally. And there is, to a certain extent, also a simplification of the debate with certain stakeholders which are really worried that carbon sinks in European forests is decreasing. And the natural conclusion sometimes that is drawn from this situation is that we need to reduce the harvesting level and go towards a more segregative approach with conservation on one side and plantation on the other. So my question is a bit of a complex one, and I would like to get your opinion on how far we can compromise on this. So getting the substitution effect, producing the materials that are cutting substantially greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time managing forest sustainably to get more resilience. You touched, of course, upon the relations between adaptation and mitigation. I would just ask you a brief comment on this very complex question.
Yeah, I guess these are the two extremes. So you can focus either totally on storing carbon in the forest through no management to very active management, where you focus really a lot on products. And I guess the truth or the best strategy will somewhere be in between. So it will need to have elements in which you focus on carbon storage in forests, but at the same time, we also, society will need products, and it will be therefore a mix of measures. So we should improve the carbon storage in forest through better management, better selection of tree species or provenances, improve our management practices, perhaps have some forests also that where we focus really only on carbon storage in the forest. But in the other forest, it could have more production oriented, and they are not always exclusive. They can be combined in some instances as well.
Thank you. I will pick a couple of questions from the chat box. The first one is from an anonymous, and he asks, he says, new studies have shown that roots and biomass stored in the ground increase its emission when the forest gets more dense with more intensive forest management, with higher temperature. This might accelerate. Do you see this as a threat to intensify sustainable forest management and be so mitigate climate change?
I'm not sure if I totally understand the comment or or I don't know the study that is being referred to, so it's a bit hard to comment on that.
I will pick others then. One is a question from Monique Axelos. She says that climate change impacts negatively carbon capture by forest. What has been done or could be done to develop forest adaptation? It's a very broad one.
What could be done to adapt forest management, to adapt forest? I think there also it depends really on the conditions that you have in the forest. A measure that is often being considered is having multiple species. So we have had in the past, at least, a lot of forests focus on single species, and for stability of forest, it's very important to have multiple species in the forest. It makes forests more resilient to impact of climate change. We can also look at the provenances that are used. So how you can have different types of the same species, but some provenance might be better adjusted to certain or future conditions than others. So we can also really look at what is the breeding material that we use in case we apply planting as a regeneration technique. And also through cutting, through how you cut the forest, you can cut everything at once, or you can cut individual trees. So there's also systems in between by which you can help adaptation to climate change.
All right, thank you very much indeed. I think that also for time constraint, we will take a very, very short break, a 5 minutes break now, and we will recess at 11:05 with the next presentation. Thank you, and see you all in 5 minutes then. Welcome back to our event, Biomass-based Carbon Sinks, Carbon Neutrality 2050. The very short break is over, and we can recess with the fourth session of the day. So we're speaking now about bioenergy carbon capture and storage solutions. And in order to introduce this, I would like to say a couple of words. So we have seen also from the previous presentation that most mitigation scenarios compatible with the likely change of holding global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius are heavily reliant on negative emission solutions. And according to the integrated assessment models used to produce the mitigation scenarios for the IPCC reports, the negative emission technology with the greatest potential to achieve negative emissions seems to be bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So we will speak about this today with Dr. Kati Koponen from VTT, and she will tell us more about the development of this technology, both on the scenarios, but also how certain states are betting on this. Dr. Kati Koponen works as senior scientist at the VTT Transitions to Carbon Neutrality team. She has over 12 years of experience from various national and international projects on sustainability assessment of renewable energy technologies, and she's an expert in climate impact assessment of bioenergy based on life cycle assessment framework. Thank you for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and hello to everyone from my behalf as well. So as said, I represent the VTT Technical Research Center of Finland, and I will talk to you about bio-CCS options today. I also represent EU Horizon 2020 project called NECEM, so quantifying and deploying responsible negative emissions. And VTT is coordinating this project. And of course, bio-CCS is also in core of this project. And the aim of NECEM project is to understand what is the realistic potential of negative emission technologies given their technical, environmental, economic, and socio-political restrictions. And I hope that our project can provide this audience today very interesting results in the coming years. So today I will first very shortly talk about the need for bio-CCS, then discuss on some potentially interesting bio-CCS options, and finally go to the deployment of bio-CCS and the possible challenges there. So as we saw in the previous presentations very clearly, the negative emissions are needed according to the IPCC 1.5 degree scenarios. And as Julia just clarified, most of these negative emissions in these scenarios are produced by bio-CCS. So that puts quite a lot of pressure to this technology. However, as said already by Professor Minks, we will probably need a much more wide portfolio of different negative emission technologies. When we talk about the bio-CCS process, we can think that it's kind of a story that has 3 chapters. So first, we have the part of biomass supply. So here the CO2 is sequestered by the plants to the growing biomass. Then we have the conversion process where different types of energy products, but also some other bioeconomy products can be produced from this biomass. And then we have some CO2 streams available, biogenic CO2 streams available that can be captured by carbon capture and storage technologies. And here, all the technologies available for fossil CCS are also available for biogenic CO2. And if this CO2 is then stored to permanent geological storages, negative emissions can be created. And to understand the bio-CCS, we need to consider all these parts together. And there are some specific features related to each of them. So first, when we talk about the biomass supply, we need to ensure that we produce this biomass sustainably and with some positive climate impacts. Also, the land use related to biomass production needs to be considered, and we don't want to create any unwanted impacts in this part of the process. Of course, we have very different types of biomasses that can be used, some residual biomasses or some energy crops. So each of these types of biomass have their own issues. Then we have the conversion process. So here we could think that it's more the market that drives the use of biomass. Of course, it can be also directed with some policies, but one could think that the market could choose where the biomass is the most efficiently used. And I would like to think that we need to use our limited biomass resources there where it is the most efficient and where the fossil products that are very difficult to replace otherwise can be replaced with bioproducts. So we can produce power and heat and cooling or different types of fuels, chemicals and fiber products. Then the CCS part, it's a story of its own. So we to capture these very significant amounts of CO2, we need to develop a whole industrial level system for this. And including the storage part. And we have already started this, but there's a long way to go to these very significant scales. And of course, we need to consider the acceptability of this technology. Also, the technology readiness levels of different conversion processes and different CCS technologies vary. So we have already industrial scale applications that can be used today. But of course, there are also many processes that are still more in demonstration or piloting phases. So what then could be the potentially interesting bio-CCS options? I approach this from a Nordic perspective as I come from Finland. And here in this figure, you can see the biggest point sources of biogenic CO2 emissions in Finland and Sweden. And these come from energy industry and forestry industry, where the biomass-based fuels are used. So interesting options could be bio-CHP plants, so combined heat and power production, where very high energy efficiency can be gained. Also, the pulp mills can be interesting for bio-CCS because they represent very large point sources for biogenic CO2. And then also biorefineries producing, for example, biofuels or then other biochemicals or so can be very interesting because there are some very high concentration CO2 streams available for capture. So I will go through these examples, and here first is on bio-CHP, so combined heat and power production. And what is interesting here is the high total efficiency of the process. So even if we would lose some electric efficiency in the CO2 capture, we can gain it back from the thermal output, and the total efficiency of the process can stay over 90%. Here, the example is on chemical looping combustion of biomass. And the idea here is that the air and the fuel are kept in separate reactors. So that way, the CO2 stream available is very pure, and so it's very simple to capture. And it comes with relatively low capture cost as well. And this technology has been demonstrated at VTT's pilot plant in Finland. The second interesting option I mentioned are the pulp mills. So here the option could be to retrofit these pulp mills with CCS. So as said, the pulp mills represent very large point sources, and almost all of the emissions created are biogenic CO2. So here very large-scale projects are possible. There is also excess heat available for the CO2 capture. So according to a recent study by some VTT colleagues, the capture cost in this kind of plants depends on the configuration and the policy scenario and could vary from 50 to 90 euros per ton of CO2. Then the third option I mentioned are the biorefineries, where CCS could be combined. And here what is interesting is that there are already biorefineries functioning, and in some of them there is already a high concentration CO2 stream available, and it's currently vented out to air. So it could be captured and stored, thus creating negative emissions. And there it is very simple to add the CCS because the CO2 stream is already very pure. So these figures are from a very recent report that was made public only last week, so also by some ex-VTT colleagues. And they studied different biorefineries producing different types of biofuels combined with CCS. And here you can see that they have used different indicators to study these plants. So the cost of capture could vary somewhere between $20 and $66 per ton of CO2. But it's of course important to consider also these other indicators, so the levelized cost of fuel, and also what is interesting is the CO2 capture rate, so how efficiently the CO2 from biomass can be captured. One thing that's possible with these pure CO2 streams is that they are of interest also for CCU applications, so carbon capture and utilization. So maybe in future there could be even competition between CCS and CCU. Here you can see a list of some activities going on bio-CCS. So you can see that there are things going on around the world. However, these are quite in a small scale. And as we saw in the beginning, all these scenarios with huge demand for bio-CCS, it is of course very clear that there is a huge gap between the actual implementation and the potential need for these technologies. There is also a lack of kind of bottom-up studies on this subject. So we have a lot of models telling us how much bio-CCS we need, but there are fewer studies telling us how to do this actually. And I found this very recent study from Sweden by Fuss and Johnson, where they have tried to make some very simplified scenarios on how to reach these targets. So Sweden has proposed already targets for bio-CCS So the 2030 target would be 1.8 megatons of CO2 captured per year, and 2045 target to 3 to 10 megatons of CO2 captured per year. And they have proposed here that we could retrofit the existing CHP and pulp and paper units for bio-CCS units. And as you see, the action should start in a couple of years. So the first investment here is made in 2024. And then after that, almost every second year or every year, we invest to a new bio-CCS plant. And to, for example, to reach capture level of 6.4 megatons per year of CO2, 7 CHP units and 7 pulp and paper mill units should be converted to bio-CCS plants. And of course, this shouldn't take place only in Sweden, but everywhere. So this gives some concrete idea what should be done in practice. And why we are not there yet. There was another very interesting study made also in Sweden and Finnish recently by Rodriguez et al. So they had interviewed the forest and energy industry companies which represent those largest point sources of biogenic CO2 in Sweden and Finland. And here are some perspectives and ideas of those company interviews. So it was clear that there is a lack of enabling policies, both nationally and internationally. So there is no economic incentive for bio-CCS. For example, the biogenic CO2 is not currently included in the EU ETS system. The companies, some of the companies also felt that they are already using biogenic resources instead of fossil fuels. So they feel that they are already doing a lot. So should they still be the ones going beyond their current sustainability efforts? I find this very interesting. Also, some of them talked about technical trade-offs in bio-CCS investments. So they have been aiming for increased efficiency for years, and then bio-CCS could possibly reduce the efficiency of the process. And also they have a limited amount of money to invest in each year. So if they decide to invest to bio-CCS, then some other investments could be delayed. And also they pointed out the lack of customer demand for CO2. So I think it's quite clear that some governmental intervention here is needed to close this gap between the need and the implementation for these technologies. So my key messages, so to limit global warming below 2 degrees, we need negative emission technologies. And bio-CCS is a technology that's already on industrial scale. And there are several technological options available, some of them in more development phase still. And there is clearly this gap between the demand suggested by the scenarios and the actual speed of implementation, and clear regulation, monitoring, and incentives are needed. And before that, we need to ensure the sustainability of the bio-CCS concepts, considering their life cycle emissions, potential impacts on carbon sinks, planetary boundaries, and sustainable development goals. So thank you very much, and please feel free to visit also our NEGEM project website to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koponen, for this presentation. I have a couple of questions myself, and then I will pick a couple also from the chat box. The first one is about the relationship between bio-CCS and fossil CCS. You showed a lot of examples of R&D projects on bio-CCS, for example. But it seems that the storage is also a very important component of building up a bio-CCS project. So how do you think, what do you think is the relationship between the development of fossil CCS and bio-CCS? Is it competitive one, an enabling one? Could it possibly bring down the cost, for example, for the overall infrastructure? And in this regards, what is your opinion about the structuring of clusters, for example, that are working on CO2?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for the storing part, the carbon storage part, I think these two need to work together. So we need all the developments possible there. And there are these projects going on. So the Northern Light project in Norway, where these actual storing facilities are now being developed, and hopefully soon we are able to use them. Yeah, the second question, I think it's not very clear how to answer, but I would see also a third component here, so the CCU. So we have also this option. So the CO2 could be used also for various products. Of course, then not always negative emissions are created, but yeah, it's interesting to see how each of these will take place in future. Yeah.
So there's a question from Cristina Calderon. She asks, do you have any estimation of the cost implementing bio-CCS in an already existing biomass plant or pulp and paper unit?
Yeah, so there in the presentation, there were some estimates. I think for the pulp and paper units, it was around 50 to 90 euros per ton of CO2. I don't have the estimates for the actual investment, but in this publication by Onarheim, they have studied this, so you can find a lot of information on the cost related to pulp mills from that publication that was linked there.
Co-capture, but not storage.
Yeah, finally, I have another question here from Peter Coleman. Given that the sector doing bio-CCS is not the sector with 2050 residual emission, has there been discussions or resource transfers to reward those taking action at the expense of those who are not? It's a pretty complicated one.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if I understood. Maybe I can try to answer it by writing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much then, and I think that we can pass to the last session and come back to the details in the closing one. We will speak now about another technological solution to achieve negative emissions, and specifically about biochar. Dr. Koponen, if you can unshare the screen, thank you. So biochar is one of the negative emission technologies, as I was saying. And if we look at the report that the European Commission published just a couple of years ago, the long-term strategic vision for a climate neutral economy, biochar was one of the negative emission technologies not considered further in the assessment. On the other side, we see that there are a lot of interesting market developments and specific interesting growth of the sector in the last year. So we are really interested to know what would be the potential of biochar, what would be their uses in Europe, and how this could contribute to have stronger carbon sinks. We have with us today Mr. Hans-Jörg Lerchenmüller, who will tell us more about the development and growth perspective of biochar. Mr. Lerchenmüller is a serial startup entrepreneur, manager, and business angel who has co-founded several startups in the field of renewable energies, emission reduction, and climate protection. Hans-Jörg has a technical background as a physicist, and after 10 years with the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems, he became founder and CEO of a company for highly efficient photovoltaic modules. For some years now, he has been focusing on biochar and he's the chairman of the European Biochar Initiative. Welcome, Mr. Lechenmuller, and thank you for the cooperation for this event. I will leave you the floor.
Okay, well, thanks, Julia, for the introduction. So let me share my screen. Number 2, here we go, Thailand. So you should see my screen, right?
Yes.
Perfect. So yeah, I would like to start the presentation showing the dynamics that we actually see in the biochar scene, and starting from the scientific perspective. What you see here is the publications with the keyword biochar, and you see that 80% of all the scientific papers that have been published so far have been published in the last 5 years. And this means that when a paper is published in 2014, it only has had access to 8% of today's scientifically documented information. And the situation isn't much better when looking at a meta-analysis that was published in 2017, as most of the scientific experiments were likely designed and probably even be started well before 2014. So there is a challenge with this. It's great that that science is so fast, but there is a challenge related to that. Now, since the situation both in science but also in industry is very dynamic, we felt like it would be a good idea to publish a white paper. And we, that is a group of 8 people that have intensively worked on biochar, on carbon sinks, on climate protection. The paper is 40 pages long. And so I will go through a couple of topics very fast in this presentation, and you will always have the chance to have a deeper look into the study. Now, so I will guide you through the content of the presentation. I will give you an update on state of technology, which applications are biochar used for. Then I will talk about synergies between bioenergy and other negative emission technologies. I will give you an overview on the current market for biochar and its growth. We'll talk about the potential we see for carbon sink creation through biochar. And last but not least, I will address the carbon sink economy that we see emerging at the moment. But first of all, what is biochar? Biochar is just carbonized biomass. That means pyrolysis as a thermochemical process converts the biomass into a stable form of biomass under limited availability of oxygen. And that creates a material that has quite interesting physical and chemical properties like conductivity, adsorption, and it has very positive effects on biochemical processes. And last but not least, it has a very high carbon content of up to 90%, and it binds carbon, obviously, as long as it is not burned, but burning biochar is definitely not the idea. Now, on this slide, you see kind of the full cycle of how biochar acts as a carbon sink. It starts with nature. So we have pyrolysis that accumulates carbon from the atmosphere into biomass. It can be wood, but it doesn't necessarily have to be wood. It could be any biomass. Then we have the second step, which is conversion of the carbon into a chemically stable form. Then we have biochar, and this biochar will then have to be conditioned to its dedicated application, and will finally then be the enriched or the conditioned biochar is then being used in a carbon preserving manner, and thus creating a carbon sink. But it's important to look at it in a way that it's storage and use, because the biochar itself is a valuable raw material that can be used, and it's not just locking it away. Now, a bit deeper into the process of how to make biochar. As I said, it starts with biochar, and it could be any biochar, preferentially relatively dry biomass. But once again, it doesn't have to be wood from forests. Then we have a technical equipment. Therefore, it's clear that biochar, at least to us, it's clear that biochar is not a nature-based, at least not a pure nature-based solution, but it's a mixture of a nature-based solution and a technical solution. We have the chemical, the thermochemical conversion at temperatures between 450 degrees and 800 degrees. And then this process creates an energy-rich gas, pyrolysis oil, and biochar. And typically, the gas is used. The gas and the oil are used for heating purposes or for energy production, and the biochar is used as a material. Now, when a new material is established, it is really key to have standards and regulations, because otherwise product quality cannot be assured. And luckily, this was recognized early on by some pioneers of the academic biochar ecosystem, and they created the EBC certification system. And this system includes very strict limits on, for example, toxic substances, but also on the use of the feedstock. And when we talk about biochar, we talk about quality controlled biochar that is compliant with this certificate. And particularly important in the context of the webinar today is EBC Sync, which was a newly created section of the EBC certificate, which was released 2020, which defines very strict guidelines on the accounting of the amounts of carbon sequestered by biochar. So we are not talking here with biochar about concepts or laboratory equipment. So in the last 3 to 5 years, a number of companies have passed the status of small number of installation to industrial mass production of equipment. And again, equipment capable of producing biochar in EBC quality. Now coming to a specific property of biochar. I mean, I said it before, biochar is an interesting material, and it stores carbon, but at the same time, there is what we call a primary benefit or an application benefit of biochar. And I don't want to go too much into detail on this slide, but I would like to highlight 3 applications where we see in the farming sector pretty interesting application benefits of biochar. The first one, and that was for a long time, the main application of biochar is biochar used as a feed additive in animal farming, which shows pretty impressive results, for example, on stable climate, on animal welfare, and also on the financial results in livestock. The second example I'd like to make is on the right side, the trees and forests. So tree plantations very much benefit of the addition of biochar into the root sector. And there is very, very strong scientific evidence that biochar added to the roots of forest or of trees supports very much the growth of the plant, as well as specifically the stress resistance or the stress tolerance, which is very important to city trees, which is why in the last few years, this has probably become the most important application of biochar. And last but not least, just to mention, co-composting of biochar it has huge benefits also to the climate, additionally to the carbon sequestration of the biochar itself, by reducing nitrous oxide and nitrite leaching, as well as methane emissions. Now, as I said, there's strong evidence. So this is not me saying that, but there is a huge number of scientific papers that have specifically been written in the last 3 to 4 years. And one of the documents I'd like to mention here is an overview on meta-analysis that have been published in the last years. And the result speaks for itself. So when we take, for example, root growth or tree growth, this is in the range of 30 to 40% improvement based on the respective meta studies. Now, biochar is commercial reality, so there is a growing number of companies that are producing biochar, that are selling biochar. And once again, it is important that biochar gets refined before it is used. So many companies, for the application in soils, it's very important that the biochar is enriched with nutrients, because otherwise it will not lead to yield improvements. So this was the agricultural. This is where today the market is. Now, there is a number of applications of biochar in construction and materials, and I'd like to make 2 examples. One is the addition of biochar to asphalt that has been demonstrated in a couple of places. And just to give you an idea, 2% adding 2% biochar makes the asphalt renewal climate positive. So this is a good instrument of changing the carbon footprint of roads. And another example that was just published earlier this week, it was an announcement from Audi and a company called Made of Air. They realized a biochar-based facade element based on 85% biochar, which really shows a very nice and, once again, a carbon-preserving application in the construction area. Now, coming to synergies with bioenergy and other negative emission technologies. As I mentioned, when you have the biomass, it is thermochemically converted, and that process allows to produce carbon neutral electricity and heat, and at the same time biochar that goes together with carbon emissions. And this is not concept, but this is reality that produces day to day these 4 revenue streams: electricity, heat, biochar, and negative emissions. Now coming to the synergies between other negative emission technologies, because like all the speakers before me, it's very clear, there is no silver bullet. We have to rely on a number of applications or a number of solutions. One of them is biochar, but it's definitely not the only one. It will not be able to provide everything, so very clear. But what is interesting is that there are nice synergies. For example, as I mentioned, adding biochar to soils, into the roots, helps plants to grow. So we have a positive synergy between afforestation and, for example, as well as with soil carbon sequestration. There's also a similar synergy with enhanced weathering, as well as, no, it's a different kind of synergy, but there is a technological synergy with BECCS, because when you produce biochar, you can always sequester the CO2 that is emitted. A part of it will always be emitted, and that could be captured in the air. Now, looking to the market, so there's a strong growing number of companies that are active as biochar producers or equipment manufacturers. And we've published a market study in February that shows the growth of the biochar production capacity throughout the last years. And you can see that it's accelerating in the last 3 years, and it will even accelerate further in 2021. So up until 2020, 72 significant installations have been installed. And we know from our members that, that there will be additional 28 systems being installed in 2021. Now, coming to the potential, we've seen that today, I guess, in each and any slide. So we believe that at least in the near term, biochar will be required to provide probably 30% of the carbon sequestration potential. And now the question is that possible? So we looked in a scenario in the white paper, how much would it be that needs to be sequestered if we could cut down the emissions to 15% in 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045 or so. And that means 15% of the 1990 emissions is 850 megatons. And that means that we would have to have 850 megatons of CO2 being captured as carbon sinks. And so, as I stated, 30% of that should be captured by biochar. This would equal to 255 tons, million tons of biochar in the European Commission. Now, the key question is biochar capable of capturing this amount of CO2? And the short answer is yes, we think so. Going a bit deeper. So what you see in the graph is the historical growth rates from 2017 is the red line. This is how the production capacity had grown over the last years, including this year. So, I mean, at least technically from the growth, if we keep the pace of the growth at 80%, yes, then biochar would be capable of providing 255 million tons of carbon sequestered. Now, again, there are many questions around that, and it's obviously anything else than easy, and for sure it will require the usage of non-conventional biomass sources, like, for example, sewage sludge. So what concerns me in this aspect is when we talk about 850 million tons of CO2, just as an order of magnitude, this is equivalent to a volume, to a financial volume of 80 to 150 billion euros by 2050. Now, that means that I'm really concerned that there will be a hype around carbon sinks, and that carbon sinks will be provided that do not provide a real climate service, or at least the climate service that is deemed to be provided. Now, this is why it's very important to be very strict on accounting, that I don't go too much into detail, but a carbon sink really has to be a carbon sink. It has to be measurable, it has to be permanent, it has to be additional, it needs to be independently verified, and double count, it needs to be avoided. Now, I mentioned before the EBC Sink certificate, and last year, startup company Carbon Future has started to operate a trade platform for CO2 certificates based on the EBC Sink standard. And this is where I personally, I'm buying certificates in the same amount as I do have own emissions. So coming to the end and to the outlook, well, biochar is ready for deployment and for growth. The technology is established at a scale. 100 systems will be there by the end of this year. We will have, we need rigorous accounting and certification of C-sinks, but this is already established. We have the EBC certificate really guarantees the high quality and sustainability. And last but not least, when it comes to growth, in order to be climate relevant, high growth rates needs to be, or the growth rates needs to be at the high levels as it was in the last few years. And generally, I would say we have to rethink the carbon cycle in order to take out carbon and use pyrolysis wherever it makes sense. And combination with bioenergy is a great example of how this can be realized. And last but not least, because I have to mention that if we don't cut the emissions by fossil fuels, all this doesn't make sense. So emission cutting has definitely not lost in its priority. Thank you very much.
And thank you for this very thorough overview of this technology. We definitely have learned something today. We have some questions. Some have been already answered in the chat. The first one that I would ask you regards a bit the economics of biochar. And indeed, I would be curious to know whether there are some studies or some ranges to define what is the cost per tons of CO2 saved, and whether with this calculation we can definitely say that we could improve, for example, the profitability of the applications that we're targeting with biochar solutions.
Yeah, I mean, since I had shown you that there is a broad range of applications, and part of the applications, it's very clear that the application benefit of the biochar itself is so beneficial. For example, if you look at city trees, because the value of a city tree is very, very high. So if you add biochar and if you reduce the debt of dying trees by 20 to 30%, which is a realistic number, there's a huge commercial benefit to it. In a way, this is an application where biochar actually, I mean, the CO2 sequestration doesn't really have to carry cost of the whole process, because the application benefit of the biochar itself is sufficiently good. But there are other applications where a contribution from the climate service provided by sequestering the carbon is necessary to grow the market. So we think that with the prices we currently see in the market for biochar carbon sequestration are end prices of 100 euros per ton of CO2, and this is probably needed in order to really grow the market at the pace needed to short-term create sufficient amount of carbon sinks.
Thank you. I will select a couple of questions from the Q&A box. The first one from Alan Sharon is asking to completely close the biocircular loop. Is there work ongoing to combine the bottom ash with biochar to produce fertilizer product with the same CHP plant you showed in your presentation?
It was about combination of ash, was that right?
Bottom ash with biochar to produce fertilizers.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to, as I mentioned, it is very important that biochar will not be applied as pure biochar into the soils. So it always has to be mixed with nutrients, because otherwise there will be a negative effect. So yes, combining it with other things like ash, but also stone meal and organic fertilizers is definitely a good way to go and to create biochar-based fertilizers with a negative CO2 emission.
And then a question also from Dario Polverini. He's asking, what is the actual status of biochar as carbon sink in the European legislation? When and how do you expect it to be acknowledged as carbon sink by the European policies?
Yeah.
Yes,
question which we also heard this morning from Simon K. I mean, it's very important that this goes together. Currently, biochar as a carbon sink is fully inside the voluntary market, and I'm fully with Simon K. that that has to be kind of organized, but we believe that there will be country legislations that will accept biochar as an eligible carbon sink in the next few years, because I guess it's very simple to balance, to calculate the carbon sequestration in biochar, because once it's in the soil, there's very strong scientific evidence that it stays there with a very low level of with a very high stability.
And finally, a bit of a technical question, if you can be very brief. There were at least 2 or 3 comments in the Q&A box asking for some details about applications of biochar combined with biogas.
Well, there are, there's a couple of R&D projects where biochar is added to biogas plants. There's, I would say it's not a very strong application volume-wise, but there is definitely scientific evidence that there is a positive effect on the stability of the process. Okay,
thank you. So I think that we are reaching the final moment of this event, so the conclusions. I will ask first of all speakers to put their camera on. Before we go to the debate, we will launch a polling on really the conclusion of what we have learned today. So after we comment the polling, I would like you to start thinking about the takeaway messages. So you heard from your colleagues and the other speakers speaking about different technologies, different solutions, and the scenarios that policymakers are currently using to better design policies that will enable basically the growth of negative emissions and increase of carbon sinks. So I would like to ask you in a moment a brief comment on what you have learned from your colleagues, from the speakers, and what is your takeaway message from this webinar. But before we do that, I will ask my colleague to launch the poll. So we have some closing questions. The first one is, what will drive the scale up of bio-based and negative emission technologies? Regulatory framework, subsidy schemes, increased carbon pricing, technological progress and cost reduction, perception of cultural shift, favoring clean solution, and others. And you can indicate 2 priorities. We will also ask you what are the main barriers from what you have understood for the scale up of bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and the main barriers for biochar scale up as well. And finally, what are the main barriers for forest carbon sink increase? So while our participants decide on their favorite options, I will open the mics and I will ask first of all Dr. Koponen maybe to comment and give us the takeaway messages from the different presentations that we heard today.
Yes, thank you for all the presentations. They were very interesting, and I think one of the clear messages was that we need different negative emission technologies and practices, that there is no one option that is the solution for everything. And also what I learned while doing my presentation is that more bottom-up studies are needed for this, like concrete actions, what should be done in the coming years. So maybe those are my messages. Thanks.
Thank you. I will pass it maybe to Professor Minks.
Yeah, thank you so much again also for the invitation. It is a really interesting seminar for me. I think some of the messages are actually CDR has now arrived in policy. We've heard this from Simon Kay, and that is, I think, the single most important thing. It's tackled by the European Union, and we also see now research programs and demonstrator programs in different European countries, and I think that is absolute key. Secondly, I would say from the various presentations is that there are, various promising options, and some just with Hans-Jörg's presentation, are really growing fast. So I was not fully aware of the pace of the growth that is currently occurring in biochar. So I think that's always very good to see. And then finally, I think the only thing to highlight is it's not an either or, and I think that has been stressed by all of the speakers. It's about rapid emission reductions. It's about minimizing residual fossil fuel emissions, and then about compensation of the rest. I think that is really important. So some of those 10 gigaton, 15 gigaton numbers that you see, I think, are not global figures that we need to take, and so we need to reduce and as rapidly and as much as we can.
Thank you. And maybe now the turn of Dr. Verkrek.
Yeah, I think both Jan and Kati indicated that it's clear that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So it will be a portfolio of measures that need to be considered, and I think this will also add some complexity because there's a lot of different demands and interest to get these options then implemented. I think this was one of the one key issues. Then I think Kati also indicated there's the need for bottom-up studies. I would agree with this, but I think there's still also a big gap between global studies on the one hand, and then European versus national studies on the other hand. So I think even bottom-up European study would, I think, also be very interesting, but with a national focus or national resolution at least. I think this would be very important to get a full picture of all the mitigation options.
Thank you, and maybe Mr. Lecher-Muller, and unsurprisingly, I will leave our European Commission representative in the end to basically take stock of what has been discussed. So, yeah, Hans-Jörg.
Yes. Well, first of all, again, I'm with Jan that it's great that CDR has arrived in policy and that there are solutions available and that people have the carbon removal as one key criteria of what they do. And I mean, carbon efficiency will be an important element of future use of biomass. I mean, a lot has been said, so I would just like to add one statement that it's now the time to start, because as I said, I've been in the solar industry and I've seen an industry growing while I was there for 15-20 years, which I was in the solar industry. That is incredible. And what Jan said, it was consistently underestimated. Even the most visionary people underestimated it. And one of the reasons why this is that modular systems work. So we have to go not only think large scale, but the success of PV was driven by the fact that you can install one solar module on a park lot installation. You can do it on a private household, you can do it on a supermarket, and you can build a 500 megawatt installation in a green field. So, and the reason is, this was the reason for the success of PV. So let's have that in mind, that we need all sizes and different technologies.
Thanks. I will ask then Dr. Kay to conclude and to also let us know what he learned from the different presentations of today.
Thanks so much, Julia. Well, I think indeed I've been very impressed today about how fast and how much progress has been made on the negative emissions discussion. Personally, this became a sort of clear direction that we would have to move in about just over 3 years ago, so not that long ago. I went to a workshop that was hosted amongst integrated assessment modelers, some pretty big names discussing it, and it was clear that this was very, very much on our agenda. And so I did post in one of the answers a link to the Clean Planet consultation that we did in 2018, where we already framed for 2050. That became the climate law. So I think we've moved pretty much as fast as the Commission can ever move. But we're moving as fast as we can to make sure that this discussion and debate stays really, really focused in the picture. To pick up on what Jan just said, it's very important that emission reduction, efficiency in a general sense, is very much part and parcel with that. We cannot rely on just providing the solution through with removals. Very, very clear. And one little point that maybe we haven't, it's not been the focus obviously today to discuss, that is the other bounding conditions of biodiversity, environment in general. I think those are very important, that we need to keep those in mind when we talk about where we're going to get the feedstocks for, whether it's biochar, whether it's bio-CCS, etc. Was very impressed by Kathy's presentation. In fact, my colleagues in the same work group who have already messaged them asking if they are well aware of your project. I bet they are, but certainly we're really, really keen on finding ways to fund breakthrough funding, innovation funding, so that it's all participants, please take a look at the innovation fund. There are smaller projects and bigger projects, so it's designed to take something that comes out of Horizon 2020 or Horizon Europe research programs and actually get them up and running and rolling. And so we think that over the next decade is going to be a very, very important tool to continue going forward. But of course, there's research funding as well that will come through in Horizon Europe. And we really hope to tune a good chunk of that funding in this direction. So we're very aware of the agenda discussion. There are lots of political considerations that need to be taken into account, amongst others, the fear by large political groups that too much removals will reduce the effort on emission reductions. And I think that's a valid concern. And also what we can do to get the biomass that we're going to get all the different applications. So I hope I sum it up there, but certainly thank you very much for being able to take part in the presentation and have such interesting presentations by the other participants. Thanks.
Thank you all. And before we show the results of the final poll, I have another question for you, and it's a bit the magic wand question. So we are trying to oversimplify what it has been said today. So to all the speakers, what are the 3 elements, either regulatory or market-based, that you think are absolutely paramount to the rollout of negative emission technologies, or in this context, increase of EU carbon sinks? I would start from Dr. Kay again, and I will call your name.
Well, I think we need a mixture of all of them. And I think we already have anyway under climate law, climate policy, we have a mixture of the market approach, which is basically run by the cap and trade system under the ETS. Then we have the regulatory framework under ESR, and we have the more policy-based work for LULUCF, which is much softer, related to how land and forest is generally managed. So it's really tuning those so that they facilitate and that they don't become stumbling blocks along the way. But there will be a place for, I think, all 3 of those. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks. Maybe Dr. Werkerk.
I missed the question a little bit, but I think you asked what are the measures needed to achieve net? Yes. Right. I think I'm not sure if I have much to add compared to what Simon said, but perhaps come back a bit to what I tried to say in my presentation. I think it should not be limited only to net. So you can only have negative emissions from forestry if you also consider adaptation. So I think it needs to have a broader set of activities or topics to be addressed.
And Professor Minks?
Equally, I think it's all about horses for courses, right? So different points of technology development and of and depending on also partially on technologies, you need different schemes. What I would highlight is maybe 1 point. So I think, or 2 points. One is I think the carbon markets are crucial. So we need a carbon price signal. Otherwise, that's problematic. I think the second thing is actually Simon pointed to that, and there are big concerns about the slippery slope with carbon dioxide removal. And I think one of the things that at least countries seem to engaging into is to have a separate target for removals and for reductions. So that seems something. And actually, so it's the third point. The third point, I think, the acceleration of innovation. I think that is for some of those more technological solutions. I think this is unresolved, and this is I don't have the silver bullet, but I think this is something that we need to seriously think about, how we can have globally at a gigaton scale removals, because we will need them, and I think this is an issue we have to grapple with.
Thanks. Just to conclude very briefly, Dr. Koponen and finally Hans-Jörg.
Yes, well, I could maybe point out the need for very clear sustainability regulation, and also that the acceptability issues need to be considered with these technologies to make them acceptable for the grand public. So maybe one more viewpoint. Thanks.
You're muted, answer.
So my 3 points are separate targets, definitely, for sinks and emission reduction, in order not to mix it up too early, with obviously an adequate remuneration for carbon sinks. That was the success of the once again the solar industry having the decent remuneration with a feed-in tariff or equivalent to the feed-in tariff. The second thing, which I think is very important, is that regulations should not be preventive of using and deploying carbon sinks. So there is clear science. I can talk about biochar because this is I know most about it, but just to give you one example, it is just legally, it's basically not possible to use biochar created from sewage sludge as a carbon sink. And there is no point. I mean, there's scientifically a very clear evidence that this is completely unharmful. And so we need the administrations to be open enough to read very recent scientific papers, because the dynamics in science is so high. So this was my second point. Regulations should not be preventive of what we want to do. And last but not least, I think the material use both of biomass, but also bio-derivatives like biochar or other things, this will become a very essential point in the future bioeconomy. So, and this is where, I mean, I have a scientific background, and this is where I think we need a lot of additional science in material research to develop these kind of materials, because the best use is always having a material use in the start and of biomass, and then have a cascaded down, for example, later on with a thermal or a combined thermal and biochar production at the end. So we need a lot of material science to develop the materials that can scope with that.
Okay, thank you. We will close with the results of our poll. So regarding the scale-up of bio-based negative emission technologies, participants, most of participants think that regulatory framework is pivotal their scale up. And also subsidy schemes, but actually carbon pricing and technological progress and cost reduction are the second and the third option. But also perception. So this is an element that was underlined also by Dr. Koponen. Second question was about the main barriers for bioenergy carbon capture and storage scale up. And 75% of respondents said that this is mostly technical, economic rather than technical, but also acceptance has a very important role. When it comes to biochar, again, the economic barrier is the one that is coming up as the first option, with acceptance being surprisingly the second one. And finally, talking about the barriers for forest carbon sink increase, again, economic seems to be the preferred option, with acceptance and technical being second and third. So with this general overview also of what our participant thinks about the future of NETS today, I think that we can successfully close this event. I would like to thank you, thanks all the speakers that contributed to the event today, the participants and the cooperation with the European Biochar Initiative, and with my colleagues Mikkel, Ines, and Claudio, who cooperated to the organization of the event. And finally, I would like to let you know that all the slides will be available on our website, and we'll also in the coming days upload a recording of this event. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very nice afternoon.